you're a trained statistician. So we're looking at perhaps some numbers. To welcome Dr. Dorsouma here after Joseph's initial presentation on the stage. You currently work as a manager for climate and green growth at the African Development Bank. You also have over 25 experience in climate policy, integrating climate into policy making. And previously you worked as expert and research officer for the Observatory of the Sahara and the Sahel. So you're a researcher by background and a manager. So you bring both sort of the research side, but you know also how to integrate this into policy making, which is quite interesting. Thirdly, my dear colleague and friend Geeta Batra, the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environmental Facility, is joining us online. She has over 30 years of experience in international development and evaluation. And as I said in a previous session when I introduced her, I'm really looking for Geeta as one of the thought leaders in the field of evaluation. She's co-authored books, and she's one of the most inspiring people to talk to and talk with in terms of how we can move the evaluation field forward, make it more useful for policymakers. Thirdly, Dr. Vijayalakshmi Vadivelu is also a good friend and the Chief of Corporate and Thematic Evaluations at the UNDP. Again, over a quarter of a century of experience in development policy, applied research and evaluation, and with a PhD in sociology and lots of research experience on governance and gender. And last but not least, our colleague, Dr. Henning Wuester. He's the director of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT, and you're bringing extensive experience in terms of climate policy, sustainable development. You worked previously at IRENA and at the Green Climate Fund, and you had several senior roles within the UN system. So you bring also this UN perspective with us, and you were the special advisor to the UNFCCC Executive Secretary. So, dear colleagues, not sure whether my math is correct, but I think this panel brings about 150 years of professional experience to you. So let's get started with Joseph and your presentation. Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Steven. I will speak in French, so if you need the translation, there is a cask here. You can put it. Yeah. OK. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour ou bon après-midi. Je suis très heureux d'être avec vous aujourd'hui à la COP30 pour présenter notre nouveau produit de connaissance, données probantes pour le climat et le développement en Afrique, une synthèse évaluative intersectorielle de la Banque africaine de développement. Je vais articuler ma présentation en 2 points. Premièrement, je vais vous présenter brièvement la structure et le contenu du document. En deuxième partie, j'aborderai les principaux enseignements traduits en termes de messages exécutifs. Et donc, ce document de synthèse capitalise sur 10 années d'expérience dans des secteurs clés comme l'énergie, l'eau, le transport, l'agriculture, pour répondre à une question centrale. Comment l'Afrique peut-elle transformer ses ambitions climatiques en résultats concrets, mesurables et durables pour les populations et pour la planète? Donc, vous voyez que dans chaque secteur, on a différents types d'évaluations que nous avons entrepris, que ce soit dans le transport, dans le changement climatique, la croissance verte, les énergies renouvelables, l'eau et l'agriculture. Donc, il ne s'agit pas seulement de ce qui était prévu, mais de ce qui a fonctionné, de ce qui n'a pas fonctionné et de ce que nous devons changer. Et donc, le produit dont nous parlons ici est effectivement ce document que vous avez. Nous avons placé quelques copies ici. Et vous avez aussi le code pour télécharger le document. Donc, je vais essayer de vous présenter rapidement la structure du document. Le rapport s'ouvre sur une préface de l'évaluatrice générale de la Banque africaine de développement qui expose le défi climatique de l'Afrique et définit le ton du rapport en le positionnant comme un pont entre ambition et résultat. Elle nous rappelle que l'Afrique contribue le moins aux émissions mondiales, mais en subit le plus lourd tribut. Notre défi n'est plus de faire des promesses, mais de passer à l'action. Le résumé exécutif souligne l'urgence. L'Afrique fait face à un défi de financement climatique de 250 milliards de dollars par an. Il présente aussi nos 10 messages clés tirés des évaluations d'IDEV. Ces messages mettent en lumière ce qui fonctionne, ce qui ne fonctionne pas et ce qui doit changer pour assurer le développement résilient et durable. Il y a une introduction qui explique pourquoi cette synthèse est essentielle aujourd'hui et comment ce travail s'inscrit dans la stratégie décennale de la Banque 2024-2033 et les objectifs de la COP 30. Elle souligne le rôle de l'évaluation pour guider des investissements plus intelligents, renforcer ces institutions et promouvoir une action climatique. Vient ensuite le cœur du rapport sur les principales constatations pour l'action et ses messages exécutifs qui forment une véritable feuille de route pour une action climatique efficace. La section données évaluatives par secteur montre comment ces principes se traduisent sur le terrain dans les secteurs de l'énergie, l'eau, le transport et l'agriculture. Enfin, la partie implication transversale pour les politiques, le financement et la mise en œuvre élargit la perspective. La résilience exige plus que de bons projets. Elle exige des institutions fortes, des financements innovants et des partenaires solides. En résumé, ce produit de connaissances est à la fois un miroir qui reflète les leçons de la dernière décennie et une boussole qui guide vers une Afrique résilience inclusive et fondée sur les preuves. Je passerai à la deuxième partie sur les principaux enseignements. Alors, le premier message est simple. La résilience commence dès la conception. Les projets qui intègrent les données climatiques et des matériaux résilients dès le début résistent mieux. Ceux qui ne l'ont pas fait ont souvent nécessité des réajustements coûteux, voire ont échoué. OK. Le deuxième message, c'est la résilience plus forte lorsque les secteurs travaillent de façon holistique. Relier l'énergie, l'eau, le transport et l'agriculture crée des effets multiplicateurs. Travailler en silo, en revanche, réduit l'impact et gaspille des ressources. Avec l'augmentation des financements climatiques, la crédibilité est essentielle. Les évaluations montrent que le suivi des financements et des résultats d'adaptation reste faible et incohérent. Sans métriques claires, fiables et partagées, pas de confiance. Ce qu'on ne mesure pas, on ne peut ni l'améliorer, ni le reproduire à grande échelle. De nombreux investissements échouent non pas à cause de la technologie, mais à cause de la fragilité des institutions ou des opérateurs. Sans gouvernance solide, sans entretien assuré, même la meilleure infrastructure finit par s'effondrer. Cinquièmement, les financements publics ne suffiront pas. Il faut de ce fait mobiliser le secteur privé via des instruments innovants comme les financements mixtes, les obligations vertes, les garanties, avec une règle d'or, le partage équitable des risques. La résilience a un visage humain. La résilience est humaine autant que technique. Les projets conçus avec les communautés, femmes, jeunes, acteurs locaux, sont mieux adaptés, mieux entretenus, plus durables. La résilience, c'est d'abord une question de confiance et d'appropriation. Septièmement, les investisseurs privés ont besoin de stabilité et de transparence. Nous avons l'exemple sud-africain du programme sur les... comment on appelle ça le programme de PIP, l'acquisition, le système d'acquisition pour les producteurs indépendants de l'énergie. Et donc, c'est un exemple qui montre bien comment des règles claires attirent des capitaux massifs. Il faut qu'on repense un peu la question de nos mobilités en termes de transport. Aucun acteur, dans le secteur des transports, je veux dire, tout miser sur la route n'est plus tenable. Il faut diversifier en utilisant le rail, le transport urbain de masse, les voies navigables pour améliorer la collectivité. Moins d'émissions et une meilleure résilience. Il faut par ailleurs construire des systèmes intelligents, pas seulement des routes supplémentaires. Aucun acteur ne peut relever seul le défi climatique. Lorsque gouvernement, partenaires au développement, secteur privé, communauté et société civile conjuguent leurs efforts, la transformation devient possible. Le risque, j'ai déjà parlé de partenariat. Le risque financier, institutionnel et climatique détermine le succès ou l'échec des investissements climatiques. Une gestion proactive des risques doit être au cœur de chaque projet. Et donc, pour conclure, ce produit de connaissances nous rappelle que l'évidence est bien plus qu'une analyse. C'est le moteur le plus puissant de l'action et de la transformation en Afrique. Il nous montre la voie à suivre, c'est-à-dire pour bâtir une résilience durable, l'Afrique doit concevoir de manière intelligente et en intégrant les risques climatiques dès le départ, financer judicieusement en innovant avec prudence et investir profondément dans les personnes et les institutions, là où s'enracinent véritablement les bases de la durabilité pérenne. Chez IDEV, nous en sommes convaincus. Les preuves bâtissent la confiance. Et la confiance attire l'investissement. Alors, à l'heure de la COP30, notre appel est clair. Investissons dans des systèmes, pas dans des silos. Investissons dans la force des populations, pas seulement dans la solidité des infrastructures. Et veillons à ce que chaque dollar climatique construise une résilience qui dure. Merci de votre aimable attention.
Merci Joseph, c'était super intéressant. Donc maintenant, je change en anglais parce que ça c'est un peu plus facile pour moi. I'd like to invite my fellow panelists to the stage. Dr. Dorsouma, have a seat, and Dr. Wuester as well. So we just heard a really interesting presentation from the evidence of many studies of the African Development Bank. Thank you, Joseph, for this. So let's move a bit further. Dr. Dorsouma, you heard the evidence, and from your extensive experience both in research and in management, I'm sure that you're very well aware of many of those issues. But let's make this a bit more practical. In your experience, how can the African Development Bank achieve to balance Africa's growing needs to get energy access, to push sustainable development, but at the same time move onto sort of a green trajectory, so that you know, the growth that is coming from Africa is going to be carbon neutral, a green growth, but at the same time that you're achieving to give millions of people who still need access to energy, that those people get access to energy. So in your experience, what is the African Development Bank doing, and how can we achieve to get this right? Because this is, of course, important not only for Africa's future, but for the entire world.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank my good friend Joseph for this very insightful presentation on an evidence for climate and development in Africa. This is very critical because as a development institution, we also balance trade-off between development and climate. And as such, we view climate change as a cross-cutting issue, because as you may see in the presentation, it cuts across all the key development sectors, including energy, transport, agriculture, water, etc. And what we have done at the African Development Bank is that beyond having just a development finance strategy for Africa, we have also a dedicated climate change strategic framework. I think this is very critical because it provides us with some guidance, some direction on how the African Development Bank could continue to supporting development across all those sectors in Africa, but at the same time addressing climate change. And the evidence that he has shown is very important for us because it shows that, you know, climate and development are actually the two sides of the same coin. They need to be addressed concomitantly, and they are mutually reinforcing, so we need to keep that in mind. Now, coming to your point, I think the bank as a development finance institution has a comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is more on deploying financing and providing technical assistance. And we have been doing that over the recent decades. For instance, we have two ways of deploying financing. Number one is to use our development financing instruments, including the Africa Development Fund, which is actually going through a 17 replenishment next month to finance development projects. But we decided that since 2016, we decided that 40% of our development finance support has to be allocated for climate-related interventions. And you know, it was difficult at the beginning, but since 2021 up to now, we have been able to achieve that objective. And I am glad to say that in 2021, we achieved 41%. In 2023, we achieved 55%. And last year, 49%. So it shows that actually there is almost half of our development financing goes to climate-related interventions. And we also, in addition to using our concessional development financing resources for climate action, we also have developed dedicated climate financing tools that provide additional resources in two ways. Number one is to have our internal funds, and we have developed some of them. I'm going to just mention one or two. We have launched 2 years ago what we call a climate action window, a facility under our development financing instrument, the Africa Development Fund, to provide dedicated resources to the 37 low-income countries in Africa, and which are also at the same time the most vulnerable countries in the continent. So as I speak, we have been able to allocate about 400 million US dollars for about 59 projects in those countries. And most of them are on adaptation because those countries need more adaptation finance. We also have introduced some innovations in key sectors, and this is, for instance, energy. In the energy sector, you know that energy access is critical for Africa. As we know, more than 600 million people in the continent still do not have access to modern energy, especially electricity. So we have recently started a new program called Mission 300, a program to at least ensure that 300 million people, 300 additional million people could have access to electricity by 2030. And this is a program that we are championing in partnership with the World Bank. And we are making progress with countries submitting their energy investment, and they are receiving support for that. Another program in the energy sector is a significant one, which we call Desert to Power. You know, all of us know the potential that Africa has on renewable energy, and we need significant investment for that. Just to give you a figure, Africa received only 2% of the 2.8 billion investment in the renewable energy over the last decade. So we need to really ensure that investment could be increased. And this is the reason why we have established the Desert to Power to help create the largest solar zone in the world in the Sahel, because this is a region with significant solar potential, and this potential is not being harnessed. And if we succeed, and this is a 20 billion program to provide electricity to about 250 million people in West Africa and the Sahel. But beyond the energy sector, we are also interested in infrastructure. You may know that 70% of Africa's future infrastructure is yet to be built. And how can we do that in a sustainable way so that we strengthen those infrastructure to be built on a climate resilient way, and also to ensure that they do not produce much greenhouse gases in the system. So we have introduced a program called Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, a 10 billion program to really build resilient green infrastructure across the continent. So to conclude, we have done over the recent years some progress, but we know that the scale of the challenge is huge, and we cannot do that alone as African Development Bank. We need partnership. We need to bring other people on the table, especially on financing. We need to bring in private capital, and we know that private capital is still flowing not much in the continent. We need to create the necessary environment to build that, to build the capacity and also the enabling environment for attracting more private capital, but also innovative financing tools such as sustainability-linked loans, sustainable bonds, also carbon financing, which could complement what we are already providing as concessional financing across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really exciting. So we heard some of the evidence, and now from a more operational perspective, we heard some of the areas where you took those evidence already into account, and also how you will do so in the future. So if we switch now to our virtual panelists, Geeta, let's take a let's take a step back again and reflect based on your extensive experience in IFC, in the World Bank, in the GEF, but also initially perhaps from the private sector where you were working. What kind of mechanisms and institutional structure are really supportive of making evidence available and useful for operations, that they can really take those lessons and build them into future projects? So perhaps you can share some reflections on sort of this more meta perspective with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven, and good morning, good afternoon to fellow panelists. You know, the GEF actually has quite a bit of investment in Africa ever since inception, right? It's been about, the GEF has been in existence since 1992, so that's a good 33 years. And over its history, it has put in over about 30 billion into Africa. Africa is a very important constituency for the GEF. And you know, it's raised quite a bit of co-financing, even though co-financing can be quite a challenge, whether it's of course a lot of government co-financing, but private sector co-financing is also growing, recognizing that, you know, donor resources are going to be pretty limited going forward. Projects have been pretty successful. Yes, it's a little lower than the rest of the GEF portfolio, you know, but not a whole lot. You have about 77% success rates in Africa. You've got against an overall of about 80% in the GEF. So it's been improving over time. So where am I going with this? I think the biggest challenge in GEF investments in Africa is in terms of sustainability. And I think you just pointed out, you know, about sustainability. You were talking about making sure investments are sustainable. But this is a challenge because it's about, you know, 55 to 60% of projects are sustainable against a larger number or a bigger number for the rest of the GEF portfolio. And I think this is where the focus needs to be. So the GEF recently has been shifting towards taking a more integrated approach, right? Not a project by project necessarily, but a more integrated approach to address the drivers of environmental degradation even in Africa. And so you have the Global Wildlife Program, you've got, you know, interventions making sure that there's socioeconomic co-benefits raised in terms of, you know, SMEs benefiting in Nigeria and Ethiopia. So I think this recognition that, look, you're not going to get the sustainability exclusively with just grant funding. You have to get the private sector involved. It is a challenge. I was recently in Liberia where we've got, you know, the commodities program, value chains, where Liberia is well plugged into the overall value chain commodities program of the World Bank, of GEF, the World Bank and IFC. But again, you know, you have just a couple of private sector people coming to discussion and at the table, whether it's in terms of roundtable forums for palm oil. So getting that private sector intervention is important. And it's doable. And it's doable. Why? Some of the most innovative pilots in conservation finance are being done in Africa, for example, with the World Bank. You have the Rhino Bond, right? The Rhino Bond is a conservation mechanism to preserve the population of rhinos in Africa. But what it has done is it's changing the market. You have Citibank, you have Bank of America realizing how do you bring private finance? But what you do need is still building capacity in terms of, and now there's another bond, the Lima bond. So these are all steps in conservation finance that are being taken with Africa leading the way. But I think still our lessons are really about making sure we build institutional capacity, and institutional capacity not at the ministerial levels, but more at other practicing levels of government, because we know the turnover is much higher at the top. It's also about, again, you know, encouraging, educating private sector for long-term sustainability. And it's not just about getting large companies into value chains. It's about encouraging what's being done in Nigeria and Ethiopia and a few countries, getting the SME sector, getting smallholder agriculture. And I'm sure my colleague Vijay from UNDP can talk to this because we've had a few successful UNDP projects in this space. So I think there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of success to learn from in Africa from the Jeff portfolio. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. This was a very comprehensive picture, and I think it really sets the stage for Vijaya and your intervention from UNDP's perspective. You've been leading a lot of evaluations with them, and I was wondering, you know, we heard from Geeta some really exciting examples, and also from Dr. Dorsouma, where Africa is the place of innovation, the place of solutions. So from your perspective, how can evaluation evidence help to position the continent as a leader in climate adaptation and sustainable just transitions? Perhaps you can share a few thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you, Sven, and thanks, Joseph, for excellent presentation, and for Dorsouma for your reflections. I just, as Geeta said, I had similar points about private sector engagement, drawing from UNDP's evaluations as for similar to other agencies we heard. For UNDP also, Africa is a major area of work. I think more than 55% of all the work of UNDP gets done in Africa. So I also would like to bring in one of the perspectives we did not hear so far about conflict-affected countries. UNDP also works in all the conflict-affected countries in the region, and their perspective also is very critical in bringing into this discussion on climate financing and what are the modalities that would work. Just a couple of thoughts before taking on your question on what evaluations can do. The lessons we are constantly hearing from our evaluations is that we should not assume that co-benefits automatically happen. There need to be more considered investment in ensuring that co-benefits happen. That's what our evaluations are telling. There are good examples. I just don't want to repeat what Geeta has already mentioned, but wherever it worked, there was considerable attention paid to making things happen and not leaving them to serendipity and things coming up on their own as co-benefits. And also about the concept of proof, I would like to just flag this for also other panelists and participants to discuss about how can we ensure that some of these models which we are talking about make sense to government and the private sector so that they have confidence to invest. Sometimes these are in theory very interesting, but we are still not able to demonstrate in a more practical way how they can happen and how governments and private sector can wade through them. And in the conflict-affected countries, I think the disparities are very huge in their ability to access climate financing. There are studies which says how staggering the difference is in terms of conflict-affected countries able to access climate financing. I don't know, Dorsouma, whether he looked at this aspect as part of their bank. One of the studies of UNDP shows that conflict-affected countries receive $2 per capita, while non-conflict-affected countries receive about $160 per capita. So this is huge, and given their institutional constraints and crisis and other multiple issues, how are they able to access this climate financing and address some of these challenging issues? There are successful examples. I will pick something which Geeta did not touch. Sudan, where even in between conflict, they were able to get blended financing and able to do solar irrigation. So, but not many conflict-affected countries have learned from those examples. So Sven, now I'll go to the question you asked about what evaluations can do. There's a lot evaluations can do and must do. And particularly unpacking the motivations and concerns of those involved in transitions, especially across public and private sectors. Programs often seem to make assumptions that do not always play out in practice, or have only a partial understanding of incentives and disincentives. Our evaluations have flagged this as a weaker area. For example, many programs assume investors will be interested and motivated to a social good when presented with analysis and returns on their investment. But in reality, it doesn't work that way because not much attention is paid to governance and other policy environment issues that put off investors. So these are some of the things I think evaluations can constantly bring to the attention of programs and policy makers. If I have a couple of minutes, 2 more points, Sven. Evaluations can also demonstrate what adaptation and resilience look like in practice. We find that this is a big challenge. While international actors, donors, academics, and NGOs talk about resilience, talk about adaptation, the ambiguity is still there, and governments and private sector are not able to get their heads around this. How can we present more successful cases in a meaningful way that's easily picked up by policymakers and practitioners, like the synthesis Joseph was presenting? How can we help them put across? I think evaluations can do that. And my last point on this, there are certain things that are overlooked when we approach adaptation from a technical point of view. For example, the whole inclusion issue of those informal sector, which Geeta was talking about, how they should be integrated into this process, because often they are left out of the national statistics. I think evaluations can highlight these groups, and the evaluation analysis can provide opportunities for a more inclusive transition process. I will stop here.
Thank you, Vijaya. Very, very interesting points that you make, and also thank you for sharing some of the evidence on drivers of resilience and co-benefits. I think that those were very important points. So, Henning, if we turn to you, your organization has the word transparency in its name. So perhaps you can start for those of us who are maybe not as familiar as some others with ICAT, what ICAT's work entails, and then continue and share from your work, what have we learned about which African climate interventions are truly scalable. So, but please first enlighten us about ICAT a bit.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I also want to thank the other speakers, and actually Joseph, for a very nice presentation. Certainly will read the study with a lot of interest. I think very important that we crucially need now moving forward. ICAT is the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and we've just celebrated our 10th anniversary. We were created at the time of the adoption of the Paris Agreement to support developing countries in their transparency efforts. Since transparency plays a very central role in the Paris Agreement, and it was clear that many developing countries, perhaps most of the developing countries, are not ready to use transparency in the way that is envisaged in the Paris Agreement. And we are focusing on action transparency. That's the A in ICAT, which really links evidence to policy making. And that notion of evidence-based, data-driven policies is really what we are focusing on. We've developed a toolbox of methodologies, guides, and tools that countries are utilizing to advance on their transparency agenda. And we have now seen with this third round of NDCs, that more and more countries are actually getting there. I think we've certainly, one of the lessons from looking at the NDCs is that the quality of NDCs has considerably improved, and we feel that that is also due to the fact that a lot of them have now been based on some sound analysis, on much better data, but it's work in progress. It's not all done yet, and I want to perhaps highlight some of the aspects where we see that replicability that you asked me to focus on. I mean, let me just mention that transparency is, of course, often seen as the basis for reporting, but we really emphasize the fact that it needs to be there at the outset when NDCs are developed, when targets are set, but then even more important, and that is the agenda for many countries in the coming year, when NDCs are to be implemented. And I think I can pick up from some of the points made by previous speakers. Engaging the private sector is one of the critical challenges that requires sound data and good transparency. Since we mainly work with environment ministries who are in charge of transparency, for them the challenge starts with engaging the sectoral line ministries. It's those sectoral line ministries that in the end actually implement policies and implement whatever is needed to achieve NDC targets. And that engagement is already a critical step. So one of the approaches that has been very successful has been a sectoral approach. We've rolled it out very successfully in Uganda, starting there with the transport and waste sector. And it meant looking at all the data that is needed from a transparency perspective, starting with the emission inventories, looking at emission projections under various scenarios, and then going into policies and measures and assessing those policies and measures and developing an NDC tracking framework for the sector. So that has been very successful because it was work done by the Environment Ministry, but together with the Line Ministry and in a way that was very engaging. And so Uganda was very happy with that. And actually, it was then the Energy Ministry that said, oh, we want the same. Please, can you replicate that and do this also for the energy sector? We've now, that's work underway. Uganda also now asked us to help them build the institutional framework, build the legal basis for actually turning ad hoc data collection into something constant and consistent over a long time. And we have rolled out a similar approach in Namibia, also looking at the energy sector, and other countries are following the example. So this is one of the approaches that we feel is replicable and can help African countries go into the implementation agenda. But let me highlight one other aspect, and I mentioned that our focus is on evidence-based policies. And so the one set of methodologies that we have put out is to guide policy assessments, assessing policies for impact, both impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also development impacts. And we feel that countries will need that kind of assessment to be able to approach financial institutions. And it's the information that is most interesting to anybody who is interested in financing it. And so this has been something that we've successfully rolled out in many countries. Let me mention Zimbabwe, where we've had a very interesting project focusing on renewable energy policies. And the assessment basically revealed that the policies and measures that Zimbabwe had in place 2 years ago when they did the study would only achieve 50% of the target that they have set in their NDC. So it was a good basis to actually get back to the drawing boards and move into other policy areas in order to fill the gap. We've done this also in Eswatini. Eswatini, based on the policy assessment, now has developed a biofuels policy, which is close to being adopted. And since the potential for biofuels in Eswatini is really significant, it would, in our view, enable a lot of climate action, and it would enable to unlock investment that is currently not happening at the scale that is required. So let me just mention those two examples and to give you a little flavor of what we're doing. But I could also talk about climate finance transparency, because that's an additional area of work that we have covered, and we have a methodology that we published over a year ago, and that is now being applied in several African countries, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Senegal, Morocco. Now Comoros is applying it, and it is a systematic assessment of the climate finance landscape in the country, so that based on that understanding, climate finance strategy can be developed and implemented. And let me end by inviting colleagues to join these efforts. I think it would be great to have the African Development Bank engaged in some of those activities, because I think it's good to get the practical experience from the African Development Bank to the stakeholders that are doing this work on the ground, but it's also good for the African Development Bank to learn from the assessments that are underway. So I think there's a win-win opportunity to actually connect communities that are working more or less on the same topic, but are very much disconnected. Thank you.
Thank you, Henning. Before we move to a quick second round of questions, just like to see whether there are any comments or questions from the audience at this stage. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think. If some of the colleagues, oh yes, great. Let me come.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting presentation. Thank you on the report. I just wanted to ask if there's going to be another round of intervention. Okay, sorry. Okay, Richard Jones from the Met Office Hadley Centre in the UK. I was just interested if there are any examples that you've got, and maybe you can bring anything on this out in the next round of comments, that you're doing on links between climate and health in terms of improving the development outcomes from some of the interventions that you are looking at. So I would just be interested in any experiences or any information you have on any health-related activities you're involved in.
Okay, great. I'm not a speaker, just a moderator. But while perhaps my fellow panelists reflect on your remark, I can just tell you that we did a big study on Germany's supported climate change adaptation. and also to mitigation, and we looked at sort of Germany's strategies. One of the studies is already 2 years old, so maybe something changed there. But we unfortunately found that at least for Germany's development cooperation, there were virtually no links between the climate crisis and health. I mean, health for Germany's development cooperation as a starter is not a priority area, unfortunately. But even in the climate strategies that we analyzed, health effects of the climate crisis, surprisingly, were not very prominent. So you're touching a very important and sensible point there.
Okay, yeah, I can respond to this. And indeed, it's not an area that's well developed, but we have had another project in Eswatini where we worked with Eswatini on indicators for their health adaptation efforts. So that was developed with the health authorities and of course the Environment Ministry, and it's now the basis for starting to collect data. So that's for Eswatini. We've done work on the health sector in Argentina, so not in Africa, and there it was very much focused on actually looking at the greenhouse gas emissions of health facilities. So that was a demand from the health sector there, and to see how health facilities, which are quite significant in terms of their emission profile, can be there. The emissions can be addressed in a way that actually improves the sustainable energy position of health facilities in Argentina, and we are currently establishing a project for Nigeria. They have developed a national health adaptation plan, and have asked for ICAT support on developing the M&E framework for that. So we are working with them, and they also told us that they have over 6,000 health facilities that they do want to, where they want to change the energy setup and then also assess the emissions profile of those health facilities.
Quickly, I know that it's an emerging issue, the nexus between health and climate. But I know that 2 years ago at COP28, we personally at the African Development Bank, we subscribed to a statement, a declaration on health and climate. And I know that after that, we have been able to translate that into our own operations. We have in the bank a dedicated department on human development and human and social development, with a strong focus on health as a development sector. But now we see that more and more health projects that the bank is developing try to incorporate climate dimensions. Just one example, I know that some health facilities recently supported by the bank in Africa have included elements related to powering those health centers by renewable energy sources. So I think it's a first start, but with dedicated focus on that sector, I believe we'll be doing more progress on that area. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
I just want to add that IDEV just published his last edition of Evaluation Matter. And in that edition, we have an interesting article linking the mental health with climate change. So it will be good to take a look on the article. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. So let's go to the second round of questions. And you hired a German moderator here, so I'm going to be very strict on timing, because we only have 20 minutes left, and some of us have appointments right after this session. So let me start again with you, Hamndou. based on AfDB's experience, what innovation are proving the most effective in aligning national development plans with climate smart interventions? So, and where would you see you would need more evidence? So what is sort of the area for innovation to align those plans? But also perhaps a call to some of the evaluators being present here and online. Where do you need to get more data from us so that you can take better decisions? And if you can do this in 2 minutes, I would be very pleased.
Thank you. I like this start of keeping on time. Yes, several innovations have been introduced recently in our institution. We are supporting a lot of African countries to develop their nationally determined contributions, their national adaptation plans, but also their long-term strategies on climate change. One innovation is that we are championing is really to align their national development plans with those national climate policies. That for us is very critical because climate change cannot be addressed in isolation from the development strategies. And the evidence already has shown that climate change mainstreaming could not be an afterthought. It should be. We should start with it at the design of our operations, and we are already innovating in that area. We have been the first DB to introduce a climate screening tool to screen all our operations for climate risk and for adaptation opportunities. So we are already doing that. On the policy side, we have set a very strong target that all our new country strategies have to be based on climate-informed considerations. So the target is actually driving our effort. And finally, and on that one, when we do country dialogues with our regional member countries, we include climate change as part of the dialogue. So it's not isolated. We discuss that with our country economies, and we take that forward when we go to mission in the countries to see how are the key elements on climate change that they want to be reflected in their strategies with us. Finally, on financing, a lot of innovations, new tools, new financing tools have been introduced to provide more resources, as I said earlier. But I think moving forward, we need to do more in strengthening those tools in order to bring in more resources. So far, we use our own resources. We do co-finance projects with our partners like the GEF, the GCF, etc. But yet, the demands are significant, and we need to attract more resources for that. So blended finance instruments are being introduced also to address that challenge. Finally, your point on data. Of course, we need data. And Africa is a continent where data is a critical challenge. Access to data, access to high quality, reliable, and usable data is a challenge. And sometimes there is a fragmentation of data. So we need to also address that challenge. And that's, for instance, climate data is very critical. We have been supporting many African countries and our regional climate centers to build data capabilities for them to provide evidence for decision making, for countries to use data to mainstream climate change in the development planning processes, etc. But it's work in progress, and I believe this is an area where a lot of progress is yet to be done in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Geeta, following on Hamndou's last point, from a Jeff perspective, what can the climate and environmental funds do to support the production and use of data and build evaluative capacities in African countries with your African partners? And perhaps a quick side note from my personal experience, I very much agree with you that it's a big challenge. At the same time, I used to work a bit with mobile network operators in several African countries, 6, 7 African countries. And there in the private sector, you have lots of data, really smart people knowing how to use and analyze the data. So when we're talking about private sector engagement, for me, this is also an area where we can engage, where we can use private sector expertise of sort of using the data, because they're really, you know, the M-Pesas and Tigos of this world, MTNs, they're world class in this. So after this side intervention, Geeta, what can we do about evaluation capacity development?
Thanks, Sven. And I think a lot is said, but I just think that, you know, investing more in national and regional evaluation units, right? So that countries have more kind of permanent teams. It's not like just project level M&E. I think there has to be a good investment in making sure it's a function that's sustainable too. Supporting training and mentorship, of course. I mean, now there's a lot of work going on with Africa Clear Centers. You know, the evaluation capability is being built quite a bit. You have the AFRIA, the Evaluation Association, realizing and taking on this challenge. Strengthening national data systems, right? All countries report to the conventions, whether it's on biodiversity, on climate. So just making sure that the data collection efforts are interoperable, right? So that you're not wasting time collecting it in parallel. So it's a little more coordination in data collection. Embedding African evaluators in real-time evaluations. And I think this is something we're trying to do a lot in our office. In fact, we're training as we go. We're trying to build local capacity by using evaluators from the continent, right? As opposed to just sending international teams all the time, because this is important to build local capability. South-South learning is a given. And in fact, the GEF CEO brought several ministers from Africa to Costa Rica to see how, you know, and yesterday you mentioned how Costa Rica has actually led quite a bit in, you know, protected area management, etc. And so there was this actual hands-on learning that took place. And this has been mentioned by colleagues, you know, about policy coherence, right? And I think this is a very, very key area to work on, because you cannot just focus on ministries of environment anymore. The funds are placed with ministries of finance or economic ministries, and they have to also understand the importance of bringing different ministries to drive policy coherence. And I think the evaluation can play a role. To give examples, and you just talked about, you know, impact, regulatory impact assessments, etc., of how that's worked, what has been the impact of different climate regulations, just educating and showing that bringing ministries together, it's really imperative. And finally, I think learning from failure is as important as learning from good projects. So what didn't work? Why didn't work? Bringing back these feedback loops. And I think we shouldn't shy away from learning, because development and environment is a tricky business, right? Otherwise, we would have all solved the world's problems by now. So I think more and more, if anything, learning from the projects that didn't do as well is as important as learning from the ones that actually have performed very well. I just want to go back to one question that was raised on environment and health.
Yes, please.
The GEF looks at chemicals and waste management and its impact on health, pollution prevention and clean technologies, and we're doing more evaluation in this space. After COVID, we looked a lot at the link between biodiversity and zoonotic disease prevention by supporting conservation, land management, you know, reduction of habitat generation. We have quite a bit of evidence there. And of course, on climate adaptation and resilience. So we've kind of built and are working more on building these links between and the evidence between environment and health. And we have a couple of papers on our website. I'll stop there. Thanks, Sven.
Thank you, Geeta. Before we move on to the next two speakers, we've got, I think, one or two questions from two questions even from the audience. So please go ahead. Try to be concise, but please introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you. My name is Andrew de Block. I'm a member of parliament in South Africa. We last year signed into law the Climate Change Act in South Africa, which, among other things, gives sectoral targets, so transport, energy, water, carbon budgets, essentially, for different sectors of South African industry and society. In terms of crowding and funding and evaluating whether those budgets have been met or measuring those emissions targets, should that capacity be developed in each sector? Should it be centralized under the Ministry of Environment? Should we outsource that to an expert grouping to give that credibility? What would be best for the investment, the credibility to crowd in that private investment as well? Thank you.
That's great. Let's take the second question as well.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Jaffet. I'm from Tanzania. I work with Wetland International, Tanzania office. I'm very interested on the issue of climate policy. The guy from African Development Bank presented. Yes, I saw in Tanzania, African Development Bank are investing a lot in terms of infrastructure, but I could not see on issues of policy and also issues of and the other issues. And now he's talking about climate financing strategy. Maybe I could ask him if Tanzania can be one of the countries that maybe you are going to support, because for me, I was part of the NDC team who developed Tanzania NDC, National Thematic Contribution. So I would be happy if African Development Bank also will come into on the ground to support issues of NDC and the other policies, particularly on finance like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. I would propose the first question from South Africa. We can take this offline if this is fine for you, because we have a project for the last 12 years now on Africa, building evaluation capacity in Latin America and in Africa, and I'm happy to talk with you about this. Perhaps, do you want to respond quickly to the question from our colleague in Tanzania?
Quickly, yes, I think beyond climate financing, we have been also supporting a lot of work on policies. And maybe the policy work is not most visible compared to the one on financing projects, but let me give you an example of what we have been doing, for instance, in aligning NDCs with national development plans. Probably, I think Tanzania will be in the next row of countries to be supported, but we did some work in Uganda, for instance, to help them, do a stock take of what they have done in the context of their current NDC to inform the development of the NDC 3.0 that was prepared for this COP30. Similarly, in Burkina Faso, we have helped the country translate their NDC into an investment plan to attract financing. In Ethiopia, we worked with them to develop financing proposals based on the project idea included in their NDCs in order to go out and leverage additional resources. Mozambique, we did the same work. So there is a lot of work going on. For instance, on LTS's long-term strategy, I know that there is a lot of focus on NDCs, but countries have also committed to develop, economy-wide strategies on climate change under the Paris Agreement. To date, I think around only 10 countries in Africa have developed such strategies, and we have supported recently 4 countries in Africa to develop their visions, their long-term visions for decarbonizing their economies, and also ensure that their 5-year NDCs are aligned with a long-term plan. These include, for instance, a country like Gabon, Botswana, Lesotho, and Namibia. So it's a work in progress, and we have in the pipeline a program to enhance that, to expand that to other countries starting next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamndou. So, Vijaya, over to you. So, maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to share perhaps just one innovation that, based on your recent work on climate adaptation, energy access, biodiversity, one innovation that shows promise for scaling up locally led, evidence-based adaptation efforts in Africa. So what is sort of, do you have a silver bullet for us, or just one thing that is really exciting that you want to share with the audience here in Belém?
Yeah, thanks, Sven. I think one example I would like to share from UNDP's approaches is around linking public services such as social protection, agricultural extension, and even private financing to community adaptation plans. We have several examples where this seems to be very promising. These have also concretely shown what adaptations look like for the practitioners and what services are needed, and have seen some scale up as well. I'll stop here in the interest of time, but happy to elaborate.
Excellent. Many things. This is definitely an exciting innovation. So, Henning, last question goes to you now, and also please be concise. You already touched upon the issue of data system and institutional collaboration, but perhaps you can elaborate a bit more what we need to credibly measure and report and verify climate progress. As we heard all over this discussion, that this is really needed to attract greater investment, and from our own studies we know that there and as we heard from all the speakers here, there are issues in terms of the data that we have. So perhaps you can share just a few brief last thoughts with us on that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, I can just briefly highlight the key aspects, and I think in terms of data availability, it is a challenge for African governments, and it's good that you mentioned that the private sector and many other parts of society are actually quite active and engaged. So I see a huge potential actually for Africa to overcome this hurdle. But data for the governments need to be embedded in institutional arrangements and ideally based on some legal framework. So that is for me a key starting point. But then you also need to be organized to actually utilize the data, because the nicest data is useless if you put it on your shelves, and it needs to be utilized in driving policy processes, which means engaging sectoral line ministries, engaging finance and planning ministries, and making sure that the data that you collect and analyze is actually useful in a way that it engages those sectors, and then last but not least, of course, also the private sector. We have talked about renewable energy, and while the global average is 20% public and 80% private finance, for Africa it's more 60% public and 40% private. So there is something that shows why it cannot be scaled up, and I think policy frameworks are a key way of overcoming it. But I want to end by again talking also to the financial institution evaluation community and encourage them to engage. I really liked one of your first points of the study, that what is needed is more than projects, and I think getting out of the focus on project finance and project M&E and making an effort to link projects and project M&E to NDCs, to policies, programmatic approaches, and the programmatic MRV that is emerging is, I think, something that I really would encourage you to try to do more actively. And we are certainly happy from ICAT to engage with partners on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Henning. And with this call for more collaboration, we're ending this session. Esteemed colleagues, I think we heard from the panelists, from the presentation, that we do have evidence. We know in some areas what works. We heard from the panelists online that we need to learn from successes, but we also need to be learning from failures, and we have some of those lessons at our desk, at our hands, to improve policy making, to improve decisions. We heard from operations that this is already happening, but still there's some big challenges ahead. Data availability, specifically in the public sector, working closer together with the private sector, and as you said, coming really together, such as here in Belém, as an international community, to work together to fight the climate crisis is essential to move forward. So thank you for joining us this morning. It was a pleasure to be your bus driver, and we arrived on time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, for the speakers, just stay on with the camera on. We will do a group photo also with you.